The morning of September 2nd, 31 BC. Off the coast of western Greece, two fleets face each other across a stretch of open water. One of them is the largest armada Rome has ever assembled in a single theater of war. 500 warships, 40,000 sailors, the full treasury of the wealthiest kingdom on earth loaded into its holds. Behind it, on the rocky hills overlooking the Ambracian Gulf, waits a land army of 100,000 men. The man who commands all of it is Mark Antony, soldier, consul, the last real rival to sole rule over the Roman world. He has more ships, more money, more experienced soldiers, and more allies than the man across the water. By 8 o'clock that evening, he will have nothing. Not because he was outfought, not because his men broke and ran, no, but because a squadron of 60 ships raised its sails in the middle of the battle, turned and sailed south, and he followed. That decision, made in a single afternoon on the Ionian Sea, ended 500 years of the Roman Republic. It handed the Western world to one man, and it began a chain of consequences that would shape every empire, every monarchy, and every notion of political legitimacy for the next 2,000 years. But to understand why it happened, why a man with every advantage could lose everything in a single afternoon, you have to go back. Not to the morning of the battle, not even to the month before. You have to go back to the document. The Roman Republic had survived for nearly 500 years. That is not a trivial thing. Through Hannibal crossing the Alps, through 3 Punic Wars, through slave revolts and street gang battles, and the assassination of 2 Gracchi brothers on the Senate floor, through Sulla marching on Rome, through Marius dying in exile, through the whole bloody catalog of a city that kept consuming its own. The Republic bent, it fractured, it bled, but it held. What it could not hold was the weight of its own empire. Here is the structural problem that no one in Rome wanted to say out loud. The Republic had been designed to govern a city-state. By the 1st century BC, it was governing territory stretching from Spain to Syria, from Britain's northern coast to the sands of the Sahara. To administer that empire, to fight its wars and hold its frontiers, you needed armies. Permanent, professional armies. Armies that spent 20 years under one general and that owed their land grants and their pensions not to the Senate in Rome, but to the man who commanded them in the field. Power, in other words, had migrated. It no longer lived in the Curia, in the Senate's marble debates, in the finely balanced consular elections. It lived in the legions, and in whoever could pay them. Julius Caesar understood this completely. So did Pompey. So did Crassus. When the 3 of them formed the first triumvirate and quietly divided the Roman world among themselves in 60 BC, they were not subverting the Republic so much as honestly acknowledging what it had already become. Caesar's assassination in 44 BC did not restore the Republic. It simply reopened the question of who would inherit his power. By 31 BC, that question had been narrowing for a decade, and it had come down to 2 men. On one side, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Caesar's adopted son and legal heir, 32 years old, slight, often ill, possessed of no particular battlefield genius. What he had instead was something rarer, an almost inhuman patience, a total mastery of political narrative, and a single military asset so valuable that he had built his entire strategy around protecting and deploying him. That asset was Marcus Agrippa, the finest naval and military commander of his generation, and Octavian's closest friend. On the other side, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Rome's greatest living general, Caesar's right arm, the man who had commanded legions through the bloodiest campaigns of the previous 20 years, who had fought at Pharsalus and Philippi, who could rally broken men in the field with the sheer force of his physical presence and his voice. And at Antony's side, inseparable from his war effort, inseparable from his political identity, inseparable from the narrative Octavian was building against him, stood Cleopatra VII, Pharaoh of Egypt, the last monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty, fluent in 9 languages, brilliant, calculating, and perfectly aware that her survival depended on Antony's victory, just as much as Antony's victory depended on her money. These 3 people, Antony, Octavian, Cleopatra, were not simply rivals for power. They were the last act of a structural collapse that had been building for a century. One of them would end the Republic. All 3 of them, in their own way, already knew it. The official triumvirate, the 3-man emergency government of Antony, Octavian, and their now neutered third partner Lepidus, had expired. The agreement was dead. What remained was simple. In a world too large for 2 men with equal claim to rule it, one had to destroy the other. Both knew this. Both were preparing. Antony held the east, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and through Cleopatra, Egypt. He commanded enormous resources. His plan was straightforward and aggressive. Muster everything he had, cross the Adriatic, invade Italy, and end the war in a campaign season. With 100,000 soldiers and 500 warships, he had every reason to think he could do it. Octavian held Italy and the West. He controlled the Roman propaganda machine, the Senate's official voice, and the loyalty of Agrippa. He was financially strained and militarily inferior on paper. His plan was correspondingly different. Don't fight Antony's strengths. Reframe the entire conflict before the first sword is drawn. And so, before any fleet moved or any legion marched, Octavian began his real campaign. The targets were not soldiers. They were minds. Antony drinks too much, the Whisper campaign said. He reads love letters from Cleopatra while foreign ambassadors wait in his anteroom. He abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, a woman of impeccable dignity, for an Eastern queen. He dressed in Egyptian robes. He wants to make Alexandria the capital of the world. He is not a Roman general defending Rome. He is a man who has been bewitched, compromised, hollowed out. The Egypt queen holds the leash. Some of this was exaggerated. Some of it was fabricated. Calvisius, one of Octavian's agents, spread rumors so absurd that Antony had given Cleopatra a foot rub at a formal banquet, that he had walked out of a lecture on seeing her pass by, that even Octavian's allies dismissed them. But the overall picture was what mattered. And the overall picture, repeated long enough, became the reality. Antony fought back. He accused Octavian of tyranny, of illegally stripping Lepidus of his powers, of stealing legions that should have been shared. These accusations had merit. They didn't land because Antony was shouting them from Athens while Octavian was whispering them in Rome. And then, in 32 BC, Octavian found his weapon. 2 of Antony's senior officers defected, Marcus Titius and Munatius Plancus. They brought information. Most importantly, they knew where Antony's will was kept, sealed and deposited with the Vestal Virgins, as was Roman custom, in their sacred sanctuary on the Forum. Octavian ordered his men to take it. It was a profound act of sacrilege. The Vestal Virgins were among the most sacred institutions in Roman religious life. Violating their sanctuary to seize a private document was the kind of act that, in an earlier era, might have ended a political career. Octavian judged that the contents of the will were worth the cost. He gathered the Senate and read the document aloud. According to the will, whether authentic, altered, or substantially fabricated, we cannot say for certain, and the ancient sources themselves seem aware that Octavian had every reason to embellish. Antony had promised vast territories to Cleopatra's children. He had recognized Caesarion, to Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as the true heir of Caesar, not Octavian. And worst of all, he had requested to be buried in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra, rather than in Rome. The Senate erupted. It did not matter whether it was true, as the playwright Aeschylus had written centuries earlier. In war, truth is the first casualty. What mattered was that it was believed, and it was believed because it confirmed exactly what Octavian had spent 2 years training Rome to believe. Now came the legal masterstroke. Octavian moved to declare war, but not on Antony, never on Antony. Declaring war on a Roman citizen and consul would make this another civil war, the kind Rome had been bleeding through for a generation and was exhausted by. Instead, Octavian had the Senate declare war on Cleopatra, on the foreign queen, the Eastern temptress, the threat to Roman values and Roman civilization. It was brilliant in its precision. By declaring war on Cleopatra, Octavian forced Antony into a corner with no exit. To oppose the declaration was to stand against Rome itself. To support Cleopatra was to publicly choose Egypt over the Republic. Antony, whose entire Eastern power base depended on Cleopatra's treasury and loyalty, did what Octavian knew he would do. He announced his support for her. He was immediately stripped of his powers, declared a traitor, and left standing outside the legal framework of Rome. The last civil war of the Roman Republic had begun. But by the time it began, Octavian had already won its opening engagement, not with a single soldier deployed, but with a document read aloud in a Senate chamber. Antony and Cleopatra had been building their force for months. By the time they sailed west toward Greece in the late summer of 32 BC, what they had assembled was extraordinary. 500 warships, 300 supply ships, 120,000 soldiers, and a war chest funded by the full treasury of Ptolemaic Egypt, the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean world. On paper, Antony outclassed Octavian in almost every measurable dimension. They based themselves at Patrae for the winter, with the main fleet anchored inside the Ambracian Gulf near the promontory of Actium on Greece's western coast. The plan was to wait for spring, then cross the Adriatic and bring the war to Italy. Strike fast, strike hard, and end it before Octavian could consolidate. Two of Antony's most respected officers, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a veteran admiral and one of the finest naval commanders of his era, and Gaius Sosius, immediately argued that Cleopatra should be sent back to Egypt. Her presence, they said, was propaganda poison. If Antony landed in Italy with an Egyptian queen at his side, he confirmed every accusation Octavian had made. Antony refused. He could not afford to refuse. Cleopatra wasn't just a political liability. She was the financial oxygen of the entire enterprise. Her 60 warships were part of his fleet count. Her treasury was paying his soldiers. Without her, he had a large army and no money to sustain it. With her, he had the resources to fight, but the optics to lose. It was the first of his strategic binds. There would be others. What Antony needed was speed. He needed to cross the Adriatic before Octavian could establish naval superiority. Strike Italy before the morale gap between his veteran Eastern forces and Octavian's Western legions became apparent, and win a decisive engagement on land, where his military genius was undisputed. What he got was Agrippa. In the early spring of 31 BC, while Antony's forces were still gathering, Marcus Agrippa struck, not at the fleet, not at Actium, but at Methone, a key port on the southwestern tip of the Peloponnese and a critical link in Antony's supply chain running back to Egypt. The attack was pre-dawn. Surprise. Elite infantry, roughly 5,000 men, landing from 50 warships before the garrison could react. The commander there, King Bogud of Mauritania, a capable soldier but working with auxiliary forces rather than legionaries, was killed in the fighting. Methone fell. It sounds, at first glance, like a limited tactical action, a port town taken, one garrison defeated. It was neither limited nor tactical. It was a strategic masterstroke. Historian Barry Strauss calls it one of the most daring and consequential assaults in military history, and the weight of evidence supports that assessment. By taking Methone, Agrippa did not just seize a port. He cut open Antony's supply line. He established a base from which he could raid freely along the Greek coastline. He forced Antony, who had been positioned to invade, to pivot and defend. Using Methone as a forward base, Agrippa launched rapid, targeted raids across Antony's supply network. He did not seek set-piece battles. He avoided them. He was not trying to defeat Antony's fleet in open engagement. He was trying to starve it. Every port he struck tightened the noose. Leucas fell, then Petrae, then Corinth. The initiative, the most precious commodity in warfare, had shifted completely. Antony's original plan required movement, speed, the ability to mass his enormous force and direct it like a fist across the Adriatic. Instead, he found himself stuck. His supply lines were bleeding. His fleet was pinned inside the Ambracian Gulf. And Octavian, having successfully crossed his own army into Greece through the window Agrippa had opened, now established fortified positions on the land approaches to Actium's northern shore. The siege had begun. Not a dramatic storming of walls, but the slow, silent kind. The kind where you don't need to break your enemy. You just need to wait until he breaks himself. Inside the Gulf, Antony's situation was deteriorating in ways the raw numbers did not yet show. The Ambracian Gulf was an excellent defensive harbor. Deep, well-sheltered, protected by the narrow mouth at Actium, which Antony's forces could control. But it was not a place you wanted to stay. The surrounding marshes bred mosquitoes. The summer heat was relentless, and with Agrippa's fleet blockading the mouth and Octavian's army blocking the land approaches, the food and fresh water that 100,000 men consumed every single day had nowhere to come from. Antony tried to break out, repeatedly. His new admiral, Gaius Sosius, launched a surprise naval sortie on a foggy morning, trying to slip past the blockade before Agrippa's fleet could react. The initial attack went well, routing a squadron under Lucius Tarius Rufus, but Agrippa, alerted by signal fires, brought up reinforcements in time to stop the breakout cold. The attempt failed. Others followed and failed. On land, Antony tried to cut off Octavian's own supply line, establishing a second camp on the northern promontory of the Gulf and moving his army to besiege Octavian as Octavian was besieging him. For a moment, it looked like a mirror of Caesar's siege at Dyrrhachium against Pompey 2 decades earlier. But just as Agrippa had destroyed Antony's naval plans, he now responded by taking Leucas, securing Octavian's supply line from the sea, and rendering Antony's counter-siege toothless. Every move Antony made, Agrippa had an answer. The tactical clock was not running in Antony's favor, and both men knew it. Then the defections began in earnest. Quintus Dellius, One of Antony's senior officers slipped away to Octavian, reportedly taking with him a copy of Antony's latest battle plans. This was not just a morale blow. It meant whatever plan Antony had been developing, Octavian and Agrippa had now read it. Whatever he arranged next, he would need to arrange from scratch. Amyntas, the Galatian king whom Antony had sent north to hire mercenaries in Macedonia, defected instead. Other allied monarchs, calculating the odds and finding them unconvincing, quietly redirected their loyalties. And then the most painful loss of all, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, the man who had argued from the beginning against the Egyptian alliance, a veteran who had fought every major naval campaign of the past 30 years. He was sick with fever, perhaps already dying. He had his boat lowered from the stern of his flagship and rowed across to Octavian's lines. He would not survive long enough to see the battle. But his departure was a signal that even Antony's most loyal Romans were now doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not adding up. Antony executed suspected traitors. He imposed harsh discipline. He tried to maintain the appearance of a functioning command structure as the substance drained away. The ancient sources tell us he was losing men every single day, not in battle, but to desertion, disease, and the quiet, grinding verdict of men who could read a situation. Inside that slowly collapsing camp, three options were debated. Some officers argued for burning the fleet and marching north to Macedonia, fighting on land, where Antony's genius was unquestioned, and trying to fight the war on different terms. Antony rejected this. With Agrippa controlling the sea, his land army would have no supply line. So Octavian would not need to defeat him in battle. He could simply shadow him and let hunger do the work. Cleopatra pressed for withdrawal. Save the fleet. Save the treasury. Get back to Egypt. Rebuild. Find a new angle. Antony's Roman officers, those who remained, were appalled. Abandoning Greece felt like abandoning any claim to legitimacy. Antony chose neither and both. He chose a naval breakout, not a battle intended to destroy Octavian's fleet and sweep the sea clear. A fighting retreat. He would form his ships into battle line, punch through Agrippa's blockade, break into open water, and sail south to Egypt to fight another day. He burned the ships he could not crew. Disease had reduced his complement of rowers to the point where hundreds of his warships were effectively unmovable. He transferred the treasury onto Cleopatra's squadron. That last detail, the treasury on Cleopatra's ships in the rear formation, is the most important fact of the entire day of September 2nd. It tells us exactly what the real objective of the battle was, not to win, but to survive it. Then, one more problem. Quintus Dellius had taken the battle plans. Antony and Cleopatra changed them. Whatever they had originally arranged, they altered it at the last minute, knowing that Octavian and Agrippa had read the original. The revised plan, whatever it was, they did not commit to writing. Whatever it was, they went into the most consequential battle of the ancient world, carrying it in their heads alone. Around 6 in the morning, Antony's fleet rowed out of the Ambracian Gulf. What emerged was not the armada that had arrived months earlier. Disease had taken so many rowers that Antony had been forced to burn over 200 ships, vessels he simply could not crew. What remained was roughly 230 warships, arranged in 2 lines across the mouth of the Gulf. The left wing was commanded by Sosius, the right wing by Antony himself, and behind both of them, in a second line, Cleopatra's 60 Egyptian ships, their square sails furled, their holds carrying the treasury of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Opposite them, stretched across open water, was Agrippa's fleet. roughly 400 ships in a crescent formation. Octavian commanded the left. Agrippa commanded the right, the traditional post of honor, and the post Octavian knew his friend needed to occupy if the battle was to be won. For almost 6 hours, nothing happened. Both fleets held their positions, and watching each other across the glittering water. In ancient naval warfare, timing mattered enormously. Wind direction mattered enormously. The men on both sides waited, oars resting, the summer sun climbing overhead, sweat and salt, and the smell of wood and tar. The Ambracian Gulf was flat calm. The wind that Antony needed, a northwest breeze strong enough to blow his sails south once the breakout began, was absent. He waited. Agrippa waited. Neither side wanted to give up the defensive advantage by moving first. It is, when you imagine it, an extraordinary scene. 250,000 men within sight of each other, motionless in the heat, waiting for the wind to decide the fate of the Roman world. Then, in the early afternoon, Antony moved. He advanced his right wing cautiously, trying to extend his northern flank and outflank Agrippa's southern position. Agrippa responded by backing away, not retreating, but refusing to be outflanked, pulling his fleet northward and drawing Antony's ships further out into open water, away from the protective mouth of the Gulf. It was a subtle, expert maneuver. Agrippa was not running. He was choosing his ground. Sosius, on Antony's left wing, pushed forward. Octavian's ships opposite him backed water. The same tactic, same purpose. Draw the enemy out of formation. Tire the rowers. Let the line lose cohesion. A gap opened in Antony's line, between Sosius's separated wing and the stretched center. Agrippa's catapults and ballistae opened fire. Archers, slingers. The creak and crash of hulls as ships finally closed on each other and rammed. The battle was joined along the entire line. Not a clean, structured engagement, but a brawling, chaotic melee of ships trying to grapple, men trying to board, lighter vessels darting in to rake oars and then disengaging before the heavier ships could pin them. Antony's ships were larger, heavier, designed to smash and board. But Agrippa's fleet was faster, and the gap in training and coordination that months of blockade and disease had carved into Antony's crews was beginning to tell. These were not the same sailors who had rowed into the Gulf in the summer. They were exhausted, depleted, too many of them soldiers pressed into rowing because the experienced oarsmen were dead or sick. They were powerful but slow, moving through the water like bears being stung by wasps. Neither side was winning. Neither side was losing. The battle ground on through the heat of the early afternoon. And then, the northwest wind came up. In the early afternoon, the wind came from the northwest, exactly the direction you needed to run south, toward Egypt. On the deck of her flagship, somewhere in the second line, Cleopatra gave an order. The 60 ships of the Egyptian squadron raised their sails. In ancient naval warfare, this was a signal that required no interpretation. You rowed to fight. You sailed to travel. There was no tactical scenario in which you raised your square sails in the middle of a battle, unless you were leaving it. What happened in the next minutes is the hinge of the entire ancient world, and 2,000 years of scholarship have not settled the exact truth of it. The ancient sources, primarily Plutarch and Cassius Dio, tell us that Cleopatra fled, that she panicked or lost her nerve, or simply chose Egypt's survival over the battle. Dio, whose contempt for Cleopatra is barely concealed on every page he wrote, calls her a coward acting on the nature of an Egyptian and a woman. He means it as an insult. Modern historians treat it as what it is, a statement by a man writing a century after the fact under the explicit influence of Augustan propaganda, determined to assign Actium's outcome to Cleopatra's weakness rather than Agrippa's brilliance or Octavian's strategy. The historian Barry Strauss, who has studied Actium more closely than almost anyone in the last generation, thinks something more deliberate was happening. He points to the treasury loaded on Cleopatra's ships. He points to Antony's awareness that the battle, as a conventional naval engagement, was already unwinnable. He argues, persuasively, that what Cleopatra did was execute the plan. Use the battle as a fighting screen, drive through a gap in Agrippa's line while both fleets were fully engaged and unable to stop her, and break south to open sea. The battle was never meant to be won. It was meant to be survived. Whatever Cleopatra intended, 60 ships raised their sails and drove through the gap between the fighting lines, through smoke, through the chaos of engaged vessels, through the corridor that the battle had opened between the two fleets, and ran south for open water. The gap closed behind them. Antony saw it happen. From his position on the right wing, he could see Cleopatra's squadron departing. We cannot know what he felt in that moment, whether this was the signal they had arranged, the moment he had been waiting for to make his own transfer and follow, or whether what he saw horrified him, whether he understood in that instant that the battle was irretrievably lost and made a desperate calculation, or whether he simply could not conceive of going on without her. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship. He followed. He left his fleet behind. The men still fighting in the battle line did not know. They had not been told. They continued to fight, hours longer in the afternoon heat, against Agrippa's closing crescent, for a commander who was already miles south of them and pulling further away with every stroke of the oar. The ancient sources tell us that the battle continued until approximately 8 o'clock in the evening. Agrippa's fleet, unable to board Antony's massive warships through conventional attack, eventually gave up trying to capture them and resorted to fire. The men on the lower decks suffocated in the smoke. Those on the upper decks burned or leapt into the water, where they drowned. Or, according to Cassius Dio, whose rhetorical instincts never failed him, were taken by sea creatures. By nightfall, 2/3 of Antony's fleet was captured or destroyed. The remaining third, those who had managed to break out in the wake of Cleopatra's squadron, escaped south. Actium was over. The Roman Republic, though no one announced it that night, was over too. On the hills above the Ambracian Gulf, Antony still had 19 legions, 100,000 men. Veterans, most of them. The largest land force in the field anywhere in the Roman world. Without naval support, without supply lines, and without a commander, because Antony had sailed south and left no orders for what happened if the breakout failed, they had nothing to do but wait. Canidius Crassus, Antony's senior land commander, made his assessment of the situation quickly. He gathered what portable wealth he could and fled to Egypt, abandoning his army in the field. He did not consult his officers. He did not issue orders. He simply left. The legions were on their own. Octavian offered terms. He spared the rank and file. He spared most of the equities and many of the senators who had sided with Antony. He executed those he considered too dangerous to leave alive. Cassius of Parma, one of the last surviving assassins of Julius Caesar, and Gaius Scribonius Curio, whose mother had been Fulvia, Antony's ex-wife, to whose fierce loyalty to Antony's cause Octavian had not forgotten. He kept 4 legions for himself and disbanded the rest. 60,000 men, sent back to Italy with promises of land and payment that he could not yet afford to honor. The greatest army ever assembled on Antony's behalf dissolved without a battle. It was a testament to how completely the campaign had been decided before the fleet ever left the Gulf. Antony and Cleopatra reached Alexandria. The treasury arrived intact. The one objective of the breakout that was genuinely achieved. The money was saved. Cleopatra moved immediately. She understood better than anyone that the war was not over. It was simply in its final phase, and she had weeks, not months, to use what she had left. She began stripping Egyptian temples of their gold, so consolidating wealth into her fortified mausoleum in Alexandria. She sent envoys to every available power, to the kingdoms of Arabia, to the Parthian Empire on Rome's eastern frontier, to any government that might conceivably offer an alternative to what was coming. She enrolled her sons into the Roman military ranks, a gesture of continuity, of legitimacy, of "we are still here." Antony, by contrast, descended into something the ancient sources describe with varying degrees of sympathy and cruelty. Plutarch writes of a man withdrawing from his commanders, retiring to a secluded pier on the island of Pharos, living in solitude, emulating the famous misanthrope Timon of Athens, who had retreated from humanity after being betrayed by his friends. Whether this is literal or literary, a neat parallel too convenient to be entirely true, what is clear is that the man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers could not immediately reassemble the confidence required to command 100. He had lost. He knew it. The full weight of it had not yet finished landing on him. They still played out their options. Attempts to bribe Octavian's inner circle failed. Cleopatra, negotiating behind Antony's back, apparently sent Octavian her royal regalia, scepter and crown, as a signal that she might be willing to deal independently. Octavian accepted the gifts and sent word that he would consider leniency if she gave up the war. It was a trap, and she knew it was a trap. But she kept negotiating because negotiation was time. A plan emerged to move the fleet overland to the Red Sea, to the Arabian Gulf, and sail from there to India or to allies in the east. The Nabatean Arabs, acting on the orders of Octavian's governor in Syria, burned those ships before they could be launched. Every door closed in sequence. Octavian moved on Alexandria in the summer of 30 BC. His approach was careful, deliberate, and inevitable. The cavalry that had remained with Antony defected as Octavian approached. The fleet that was still in the harbor raised oars in the Octavian salute and surrendered without a fight. Antony led what infantry remained out to meet the advancing force and was defeated in a skirmish that lasted barely long enough to call it a battle. He returned to the city. Someone, we do not know who, we do not know whether it was a lie or a mistake or a deliberate final act, brought him word that Cleopatra had already killed herself. Antony fell on his own sword. He did not die immediately. The wound was severe but not instantly fatal. His servants, those who had not already fled, carried him to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had sealed herself with her treasures and her two closest attendants. She refused to open the doors. Instead, she and her women pulled him up by ropes through the upper window, a grown man's weight on a rope. Cleopatra's arms straining in the effort, blood on her hands and face by the time they got him inside. He died in her arms. His last words, according to Plutarch, were that she should not mourn him for the manner of his death, but remember him for what he had been, that he had not been dishonored at the end, only conquered by another Roman. He was the last man to say that and be believed. After him, there would be no other Romans, only subjects. Octavian moved carefully with Cleopatra. He needed her alive. She was the centerpiece of the triumph he was already planning in his mind. The Egyptian queen paraded in chains through the Roman Forum, the proof that he had defeated not a civil enemy, but a foreign power. He placed her under guard, but treated her with calculated courtesy. He arranged for her to be properly fed and cared for, her wounds from her grief tended. He visited her in person, probably once, a meeting whose exact content neither side ever made fully public. Octavian left convinced that Cleopatra intended to survive, to appear in his triumph, to live. Cleopatra had spent her entire life reading the intentions of powerful men. She read his correctly. She had already prepared. Precisely what she used to die, snakes smuggled in water jars or a basket of figs, or poisoned by another means, is a question 2,000 years of scholarship has not definitively answered. The ancient sources themselves say no one knows for certain. What they agree on is this: when Octavian's men burst through the door, they found her laid out on her golden couch, dressed in her royal robes, her 2 attendants dead at her feet. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years. She was the last pharaoh of a dynasty 3 centuries old. The Ptolemaic line ended in that room. Octavian returned to Rome and was granted 3 triumphs, 3 consecutive days of celebration. One for his campaigns in Dalmatia, 1 for Actium, 1 for Alexandria. He was precise, always, about what each triumph meant. He did not celebrate Roman prisoners. He did not display Roman generals in chains. He paraded an effigy of Cleopatra, lying on her golden couch, dying, snakes coiled around her arms. Her children, Alexander Helios, dressed as the sun god, and Cleopatra Selene, dressed as the moon, walked behind their mother's effigy in chains. Her youngest child had not survived the journey to Rome. He gave 400 sesterces, roughly half a year's wage for a legionary, to 250,000 Roman citizens. He gave a full year's wages to 120,000 veterans. He announced the closing of the doors of the Temple of Janus, a ceremony performed in Rome whenever the world was at peace, a ceremony that had not occurred in generations. Rome was not actually at peace. Wars continued on the frontiers. Octavian was not one to let the truth interfere with a symbolic moment. Then he did something far more consequential than any triumph. In 27 BC, he stood before the Senate and gave one of the most carefully choreographed speeches in political history. He told them he was laying down all his extraordinary powers, that he had done what needed doing, avenged Caesar, restored order, won the peace, and that the Republic could now resume its proper functions. He was returning everything. He was done. The Senate, which understood its role in the performance, refused. They begged him to stay. They could not possibly manage without him. And they voted him the title Augustus, not a political office, nothing as crude as a title of power, but something more. A word freighted with sacred and moral authority, meaning something closer to the consecrated one, the first among all Romans, the man the gods themselves had elevated. He accepted, reluctantly, graciously, modestly, and he kept every power he had just offered to return, dressed in different legal language. The Roman Empire had begun, not in a coup, not in a decree abolishing the Republic, but in a Senate meeting, in a performance of reluctance, in the careful preservation of every institution of the Republic, while draining each one of its actual power and transferring it, in perpetuity, to a single man. Octavian, Augustus, would rule for 44 more years. One other thing happened quietly in the summer of 30 BC. Caesarion, Julius Caesar's biological son by Cleopatra, 17 years old, the young man who was the one person in the world whose existence posed a genuine legitimacy threat to Octavian's claim as Caesar's heir, was located and executed. His tutors had tried to lead him to safety. They were too slow or too easily found. Octavian's agents caught him. The boy was killed. Augustus later said, when pressed, that there was no room in the world for two Caesars. One of his advisors reportedly put it more bluntly: "It is not good to have too many Caesars." The battle at Actium was 30 miles of smoke and burning wood in a single September afternoon. Its consequences lasted 500 years. Egypt became a Roman province, the most important in the empire. Its grain surplus fed the capital. Its wealth funded the legions that guarded the Rhine and the Danube and the Euphrates. For the next 4 centuries, whichever man controlled Egypt controlled Rome's nervous system. The legions that had fought for Antony became the legions that held the empire's borders under Augustus. Civil War's veterans became empire's enforcers. Same men, same skills, different master, different story told about who the enemy was. It is one of history's minor ironies that the soldiers who had pledged their lives to the last man who might have preserved the Republic ended up garrisoning the institution that replaced it. And the Principate, Augustus's system of rule through the fiction of restored republican institutions, became a template. One man, supreme power, dressed in the language of tradition and service and reluctant necessity. Every emperor who followed him used the same formula. Every monarch who claimed to rule by consent, by divine favor, by the will of the people channeled through his singular person, every one of them, consciously or not, was running Octavian's play. The Roman Empire endured in the West until 476 AD. In the East, the Byzantine Empire that called itself the continuation of Rome lasted until 1453. 5 centuries in the West, 15 in the East, all of it flowing from the afternoon when 60 Egyptian ships raised their sails and a general followed his fleet into the open sea. Here is the thing that history books tend to miss about Actium. It is very tempting to look at September 2nd, 31 BC, and say, here is the battle that decided everything. Cleopatra fled. Antony followed. Rome was changed forever. But Antony did not lose the war on September 2nd. He lost it in the months before. Port by port, supply route by supply route, defector by defector, in the slow, grinding work that Marcus Agrippa did while Octavian was managing the Senate in Rome. Agrippa took Methone before Antony had properly consolidated his position. He cut the supply line before the siege had fully formed. He denied Antony's fleet the open water it needed to operate. He forced Antony, a land general of the First Order, a man who had no serious rival in a pitched infantry engagement, to fight a naval campaign on terms dictated entirely by his opponent. Every great general, eventually, faces the battle he is worst equipped to fight. Antony's was at sea in the summer heat off the Greek coast, with oarsmen too sick to row properly. Against a strategist he could not match on water. And yet even then, even boxed in, diseased, deserted, outmaneuvered, Antony might conceivably have found another path. He had 100,000 soldiers on land. He had a fighting retreat option. He had Cleopatra's treasury still intact. Wars have been turned from worse positions. What he could not overcome was the second loss, the political one, the loss of the narrative. Because here is the deepest truth of Actium, the one that echoes farthest. Octavian did not win this war because he was the better soldier. He manifestly wasn't. He won because he controlled the story from the beginning. The propaganda campaign that branded Antony as a man bewitched by an Eastern queen. The illegal seizure of the will that he read to a Senate chamber. The legal sleight of hand that reframed a civil war as a foreign threat. The three triumphs that displayed an Egyptian effigy while erasing the Roman nature of the conflict from public memory. The modest refusal of honors that were almost certainly suggested by his own agents. The gracious return of powers he had never actually surrendered. Every military success Agrippa achieved, Octavian translated into political capital. Every weakness Antony displayed, Octavian translated into proof of foreign corruption. The battlefield was where the war was confirmed. The Senate chamber, the forum, the coin faces, the court poets. That was where it was won. Augustus spent 44 years as the first emperor of Rome perfecting the machine that Octavian had built in those 12 years of civil war. He commissioned poets to write his legacy. He rebuilt the city in marble to announce his permanence. He cultivated the myth of the modest servant of the state so carefully that within a generation, Romans who had lived through the Republic began to remember it as a chaos they were glad to have escaped. He was not wrong that the Republic was broken. The Republic had been breaking for 100 years. What Augustus understood, what Actium proved, is that in a conflict for supreme power, the army is the instrument and the narrative is the weapon. Control the story, and you control what the army fights for, what the Senate votes for, what the people remember, and what their grandchildren are taught. Antony had the larger fleet. He had the better soldiers. He had the money. He lost. Because Octavian had the story, and at Actium, on a September afternoon off the coast of Greece, the story won. The doors of the Temple of Janus were closed in 29 BC for the first time in living memory, a ceremony to mark the coming of peace. The wars, Augustus declared, were over. He stood in the forum, in the shadow of the temple, and Rome celebrated around him. There were games and feasts and the smell of animal sacrifice on 100 altars. Children who had been born into a world of civil war were now told, officially, that the civil war was finished. It was not entirely a lie. The killing, the large-scale organized slaughter of Roman by Roman, was indeed over. Rome would not turn on itself like that for another century. What was finished along with the war, what was sealed inside those temple doors as they swung shut, was the idea that Rome's government was a shared thing. That power moved through institutions, through elections, through the argument of equals, that no one man could own the state. The Republic, gone, not broken by a tyrant, not abolished by decree, not stormed by armies in the night. It was hollowed out, its forms preserved and its substance extracted by a 32-year-old man who understood that you do not need to destroy an institution if you can make yourself indispensable to it. The last moment it could have been different was on the water off Actium, in the window before Cleopatra's ships raised their sails. In the handful of months before, when Agrippa might have been stopped at Methone, when the supply lines might have held, when the defectors might have stayed. In the year before that, when the Senate might have refused to accept a stolen will as grounds for war. But the Republic's own institutions, the Senate's susceptibility to narrative, the legion's loyalty to paymaster over principle, the Roman world's exhaustion with 40 years of civil conflict, had made all of those moments impossible long before Actium arrived. Actium did not end the Republic. It revealed that the Republic had already ended. The battle on the water was simply the announcement.